Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. It's time for a retro TV review. This review is one which was on my radar to do in a couple of months' time. But the fact that the show has now been exhumed from the archives and is currently being broadcast on, I think it's Friday nights, on the archive channel Talking Pictures, made me jump it up the queue a little bit. So I've done a bit of research. I've got some notes. Let's talk about a classic from the early 1970s. A series that was, and in some ways still is, way ahead of its time. One of the first shows on TV that looked at technology and thought, wait a minute, and had ecological concerns about what mankind, in his unceasing race to get bigger and better machines and make bigger and better advances in technology, was perhaps not thinking about what it might be doing to the world we live in. I'm talking about a show called Doomwatch. Hello, welcome back. Yes, we're talking about Doomwatch today. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping to do. Yes, I have a new haircut. I look like a right Bobby Dazzler. I think you'll agree. It's Thursday afternoon. It's a bit wet and wild. We're waiting for storm something or other to come crashing in overnight. So I thought I'd sit down today and do this retro video, which I've been waiting to do for a few days. But before I get stuck into the story of Doomwatch, a couple of little housekeeping things to mention about the channel. First of all, thank you very much and welcome aboard to some new subscribers, dozens of new subscribers who've leapt on board since the weekend when I posted my video about Red Dwarf, possibly not returning quite as soon as we anticipated and possibly not returning at all, based on comments made by Craig Charles to RadioTimes.com last week. It was just a little video, a little sort of a placeholder that went up on Sunday lunchtime. Has become very popular. It's rushing towards 4,500 views. Which for me, as a small channel, is quite, I'm quite pleased with that. And some new subscribers have come on board. So welcome. I hope you do stick around because there's hopefully loads of stuff on this channel to come and stuff in the past. If you look back at my playlist, you'll see loads of retro stuff and films and TV, and I hope you'll get stuck and enjoy all that. But what did occur to me thinking about, wow, this has been watched by 4,500 people, is that only 3-4 dozen of them actually seem to have subscribed to the channel, which actually bumped my numbers up, of course, which is always lovely. But it does seem odd that people watch the video and don't subscribe, because presumably they enjoyed the video and they got something out of it. So you'd think that they might press that subscribe button and press a like button. I've had loads of comments as well, which was fantastic. All of them really upbeat and positive, and it's always nice to hear people's memories of watching these old shows. I did have to prune a couple of things here and there because unfortunately a couple of people jumped in making comments about Doctor Who again and all that sort of stuff that doesn't belong in this particular video. But by and large, it's great to have comments from people that have that nostalgia element that comes with talking about an old show. And not that Red Dwarf's necessarily an old show, because it's still a current show in some ways. But it is nice to get comments from people remembering when they first saw it and episodes they particularly remember. And I always appreciate that sort of thing. Which is why I think it would be nice for people who watch the video subscribe to them, because looking at my analytics, it appears that 65% of my viewers are from people who aren't subscribed to the channel. And I know I'm not the only one, because I've seen other channels have much the same issue. I was going to say problem, but it's not really a problem, because people are watching. But it does seem odd that people sort of come along and don't want to stay along for the ride. So I will say to you, if you're new to this video, please like and subscribe. Just press the subscribe button, press a like button, and of course leave a comment. It would be nice to get a community type thing going on here. That would be absolutely marv. Right, I think that's it. Oh no, one more thing I wanted to mention in terms of housekeeping. Film reviews in the future on this channel are going to be slightly different. I've noticed that doing reviews of modern films and new releases don't do all that well on this channel. And I'm not surprised, because they're sort of 10 a penny. Everybody does reviews of new films, and unless you're one of the big names, the Chris Stuckmans or whatever, people don't really pay much attention to small fry like me. But I do enjoy reviewing new films, so if you're interested in my views on new films, I have resurrected my old Letterboxd channel, which I started about 2-3 years ago, and I did about 2 reviews, then forgot about it. But I've resurrected that, and I'm now going to be posting, not exactly lengthy, but decent sized chunks of reviews on my Letterboxd channel. And I think there are now 10 reviews up that I've reviewed every film I've watched this year so far, which is about 8. So if you want to go to Letterboxd, I'm under PMount 1959. You can go along there. I think you can like the... Is it a channel? You can like it and make comments and things. That'll be very nice too. That's where you will find most of my commentary on new films. Unless they're the big blockbusters. Of course, I'm going to be doing the new Captain America film when that comes out. Haven't got around to seeing Wolfman yet. It's still on my list of things to see. So I'll be doing the big genre films, but perhaps things which aren't necessarily in this channel's wheelhouse will end up on Letterboxd. And of course, I'll still be contributing reviews to Starburst magazine online and in the magazine itself. So if you are vaguely interested in my opinions on new films, that's where you'll find them going forward. Right, let's talk about Doomwatch. Yeah, Doomwatch is a fascinating series that, especially these days when we're so aware of AI and technology, and we're always hearing about concerns about the effect of this new technological advancement, or this new thing is being invented and developed, and oh my God, what's it going to mean? Technology was starting to move forward in the 60s and 70s. Post-war, the country and the world was pulling itself together a little bit, and major scientific advances were being made in terms of drugs and in terms of medicine and technology generally. Things were sort of rolling forward. But it appeared that nobody was sort of saying, well, actually, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Are there side effects to this? Are there things that could go wrong? But there were people who did have some concerns about where we were going and the damage we were doing to the world we live in. And interestingly, Doomwatch, which debuted, as I said, in 1970 in colour, when BBC was finally moving into a full colour service, Doomwatch has its roots in, of all places, Doctor Who. Let me tell you how. Back in the later 60s, probably about 66, Doctor Who had a new script editor. His name was Jerry Davis. Doctor Who was in its third series, and I think it's fair to say the novelty of the show was wearing off a little bit, and ratings were starting to dip. Not nosedive, but they were dipping a bit, and interest was fading slightly. Jerry Davies came aboard as a new script editor, and he felt that the show was becoming a little bit twee, perhaps a little bit whimsical, a little bit safe. He wanted to beef it up a bit, and he wanted to make it a bit more relevant and a bit more modern. To this end, he enlisted the help of a scientist from the University of London. His name was Christopher Magnus Howard Pedler, known affectionately, we can only hope, as Kit. He asked Kit Pedler to suggest some scientific concepts that could underscore the core idea of Doctor Who and just beef it up and give it a bit more oomph. The first results of Kit Pedler's involvement in the show were a 4-part serial called The War Machines, which was written by Ian Stewart Black. This was something unusual for Doctor Who. In fact, there is a retro Doctor Who review way back in the channel if you want to hear my thoughts on The War Machines. It was contemporary Earth, and Doctor Who hadn't really done contemporary Earth even that far into its third series. It brought Doctor Who into modern day London and the idea of a supercomputer at the top of the newly built post office tower that had a sort of sentience, an artificial intelligence, if you will. And it planned to dominate humankind with the help of these tank-like robots. Fanciful stuff perhaps, but in 1966, so ahead of its time, because it's really only the last couple of years that people have started talking about AI and artificial intelligence and the risks of computers and machines having freedom of thought and free will. So Pedler was years ahead of his time. The War Machines reinvigorated Doctor Who, gave it a new look, and he quickly followed that up with the creation of the Cybermen. Jerry Davis and Kit Pedler worked very well together. It turned out that they had similar concerns about science and similar misgivings about the way the scientific community seemed to be rushing headlong towards doom. Bear that word in mind. So they created the Cybermen, particularly because of Kit Pedler's concerns about body and organ transplants, which were becoming a thing in the late 1960s. And they postulated the idea of a dying race in the future who had replaced their dying body parts with machine parts, but in doing so lost their sense of humanity. Thus they created the Cybermen for William Hartnell's last adventure, The 10th Planet. These rather tragic creatures who had lost their humanity. They came from a planet called Mondas, which was Earth's long-forgotten twin planet, and in replacing their body parts with machine parts, their humanity had gone, and they were focused purely on logic and the need to keep their species going at any cost, even if that meant, well, doing terrible things to humanity. The Cybermen, of course, were massively popular in Doctor Who in the 60s, but as the stories rolled by, they became more ruthless aliens, and I think they lost that sort of the tragic element of their story. And of course, in more recent years, they've been depicted pretty much as cannon fodder to be shot at and knocked down. And I think the idea of them being organic creatures under the suits has been slightly lost. But anyway, the Cybermen were a huge hit on Doctor Who, and Kit Pedler and Jerry Davis clearly enjoyed working together, and with their shared passions about technology and where it was going, they began to put together ideas for a series which looked just at this sort of thing. Together they came up with the idea of a government-funded and sponsored organisation which would be looking at technology and keeping an eye out for technology and looking out for things that weren't quite right, where technology was perhaps going the wrong way and putting humanity and the planet at risk. The ideas kept forming and churning, and they took them to Terence Dudley, who was a senior BBC producer at the time. He loved the idea, and he wanted the BBC to run with it, and I think it was late 1968. BBC copyrighted the name of the show, which was by now Doomwatch. And they set to work on putting together ideas for stories. Kit Pedler was the ideas man. He would be looking at the scientific community and the scientific press and spotting things where there might be story potential in the future. This new technological advancement, what if this happens or this goes wrong, or certain things that he was aware of that he thought there might be interesting narratives. So the first series of Doomwatch went into production, and of course what any show needs is a cast to drive the stories. And I think that they put together a really interesting cast for this series. The head of the Doomwatch organisation, which was the Department for the Observation and Measurement of Scientific Work. Not the best acronym in the world, in fact, not really an acronym at all. But the head of the organisation was Dr. Spencer Quist. He was played by a very charismatic actor called John Paul. Spencer Quist was very much aware of the dangers of technology because in the backstory of the series, he'd been involved in the development of the Manhattan Project, and because of the side effects of that, his wife had died of radiation poisoning, and he carried with him this guilt. And this is one of the things that drove him to want to keep a watchful eye on technology because of the damage it can do. Quist was an interesting character. He was sort of a patrician type character, probably in his 50s, but very brusque, very no nonsense. He didn't put up with nonsense. He didn't have much of a sense of humour. He did have a fine line in mustard coloured cardigans, which he wore pretty much throughout the series. His assistant, deputy, or whatever you want to call him, his top man, was Dr. John Ridge. He was played by an actor called Simon Oates. John Ridge was, I imagine, planned to be sort of the macho hero figure, a sort of Avengers type character, if you like. He was debonair, suave, he wore floral shirts, and he was very good with the ladies, very cheeky, and very much a ladies' man in the old school sense of that expression. He was no stranger to sort of breaking and entering into places and doing what was necessary to get the information that was needed and to move stories along. Simon Oates was an actor who'd appeared in a TV series called Mask of Janus a few years before, sort of an espionage series on the BBC, which no longer exists, sadly. That transformed for its second series into a slightly pacier series called The Spies. And that was produced by Terence Dudley, so clearly we can see the connection between Terence Dudley producing Doomwatch and Simon Oates being cast, because producers obviously are involved in castings of TV shows and inevitably will like to work with people that they've worked with in the past who've given them good performances. So whereas Dr. Ridge was expected to be the sort of the heartthrob figure, he was completely overshadowed by Robert Powell as Toby Wren, who debuted in the show's first episode and in the style of most first episodes helped set up the core idea of the series. Robert Powell, of course, is hugely famous now, one of our most popular actors. He went on to massive acclaim 1977 when he did the ITC series Jesus of Nazareth, which sort of launched him into the stratosphere, and he went on to do loads of films and TV. One of those great, solid, well-known British character actors. He played Toby Wren, and it was his first major TV appearance, and he was an instant hit. He was the show's heartthrob. He was young, willowy, determined, moralistic, and he became the show's USP, I suppose, in that first season. The final member of the Doomwatch team was Colin Bradley, who was in charge of Doomwatch's massive room-sized computer. Usually wearing a white lab coat, he was played by Joby Blanchard, and he was a gruff, no-nonsense northerner who spoke his mind, and he didn't have time for authority figures, didn't have time for the red tape, the pencil pushers, and he was gruff and bluff, and he swore a little bit, as much as the 1970s TV would allow. But he was in some ways the sort of the backbone of the series, a solid supporting character who never really got the limelight, but he was there giving the technical and scientific support and punching the buttons on Doomwatch's massive computer. In terms of female characters to show, however, I think today's feminists and culture warriors would probably furrow their brows and shake their fists because it didn't really do much in terms of lead female characters. I think there was sort of a secretary character who was very much there as a character who just answered the phone and brought messages into Dr. Quist and put up with Dr. Ridge's leering. But in the second series, they did change things slightly by introducing a character of Dr. Faye Chantry, played by actress Jean Trent. She was a scientist, and if she wasn't exactly Quist's equal, she was sort of up there with him, and she was a ferocious intellect and an interesting character that was unfortunately phased out in the third series. So Doomwatch arrived on British TV in February 1970, as I say, the instant hit. The first episode is particularly memorable. I watched it again last week when it aired on Talking Pictures. It's called The Plastic Eaters, and it introduces quite subtly the idea of the series. Quist explains what Doomwatch is, and he's in constant conflict, as he is throughout the series, with a government minister character played by the incredible John Barron, who playing pretty much the role he played throughout his career, this officious, brusque and quite frightening sort of authority figure. And these two butted heads quite a lot throughout the series. The minister didn't necessarily approve of Doomwatch, and he didn't really agree with it, but he sort of understood the need for it, and sometimes he supported Quist and sometimes they were at odds with one another. But in the Plastic Eaters, they were very much at odds because a new plastic-eating virus had somehow escaped from a laboratory facility at Beeston, found its way onto an airplane, and in the opening sequence we see a scene where the infrastructure of the plane is literally melting. Plastic is dripping down from the ceilings onto passengers, the controls are falling apart, and the plane crashes, and all lives are lost. This is the thrust of that first episode, the idea of a virus which is designed to destroy plastic. And this is something which is in the news today about biodegradable plastic and plastic waste that can't be destroyed. And this first episode of Doomwatch in 1970 came up with the idea of a virus that would destroy plastic. But in doing so, it risks causing damage all across the world. And there's a sequence later on in the episode when Robert Powell's character, Toby Wren, is on a plane back from South America where he's gone to investigate the debris from the first plane crash. And he inadvertently releases the virus onto the plane. And there's some actually well-rendered scenes of this plastic collapsing all over people and plastic bag collapsing, and near disaster as this plane also almost crashes. Doomwatch was an instant hit then. 13.5 million viewers watched that first episode, and across those first 13 episodes, people were entranced and I think probably quite terrified by some of the ideas the show was putting forward and making them think about things that they'd probably never given much consideration to before. There were other memorable episodes in the first series. I think one of the most memorable for all sorts of reasons was called Tomorrow the Rat. Again, an interesting idea about rats that are growing larger and bolder and more carnivorous. Extra large rats that are emerging across London. And there's some quite nasty scenes of rats sort of attacking people and rats out in the public, and one quite graphic sequence at the end. If you haven't seen that episode, be prepared for quite a grisly scene at the end. It's also unfortunately memorable for a couple of other scenes which don't work so well when characters are attacked by rats, particularly Robert Powell's character in the kitchen of a home that's been attacked by rats, or there has been sightings of rats, and the rats are crawling all over him, and these are very much sort of fake rats stuck to his clothes, and he's sort of trying to beat them off with saucepans and frying pans and literally dancing across the room. It is unfortunately quite an amusing sequence in what should be a horrific scene. That's, I think, one of the things that people sort of most remember about that episode. But apart from that, it is quite a strong, unnerving episode. And there are other good episodes in that first series. The Battery People, in which miners in a South Wales village become sterile thanks to chemicals used by a local fish farm. And particularly the series finale, Survival Code, where it's suspected that a nuclear warhead has washed up at an English coastal resort. This is a particularly important episode because this is where we lose Toby Wren, Robert Powell, from the series. He'd only signed up for 1 year and he was keen to move on for other things. Having established himself here, he didn't want to be tied to a long-running series, so the show's creators came up with an explosive finale, and Toby Wren is killed off when he defuses the nuclear element of the bomb, but the traditional bomb, the part of it, explodes and he is killed in the explosion. It's devastating for the fans of the series, of course, who had come to like the character. I think it's fair to say that the show never properly recovered from losing Toby Wren's character because he'd been such a big hit with people. But when the show came back for its second series, which started in December of 1970, only a few months after the first series had ended, the first episode is particularly memorable. You Killed Toby Wren was the first episode of the second series, and that was written and directed by producer Terence Dudley, and is a very, very strong character piece, which is all about the aftermath of Toby Wren being killed and the repercussions and the accusations. And it's particularly memorable scenes with Simon Oates and John Paul shouting and screaming and the recriminations, and it's ferociously powerful. And I think what that does particularly, I think it shows the power of that sort of television production, the videotape production, whereas TV is all sort of glossy and filmed these days. It lacks the immediacy sometimes that videotape shows have, because particularly in this episode, you're there with these two guys in the room in the sharpness of videotape, and you could see the spittle flying as these two blokes were raging at one another. But the series continued. New characters were brought in. I mentioned Faye Chantry, who came in. The show did make some efforts to replace Toby Wren. There was a character called Jeff Hardcastle, played by John Nolan. He sort of drifted in and out, but he never really established himself properly. But the show sort of felt as if its heart had gone in a way. It was still dealing with really important issues. I particularly remember an episode called The Invasion, which I think might be the second one of the second series, which was about an entire village in the north of England had to be evacuated because of the discovery of a cache of deadly bacteria that had been developed in World War II. And there are very strong film sequences in this about the military descending upon this village and getting everybody out. And the end of the episode would suggest that because of the nature of the bacteria, they will not be allowed to go back to this village. There was also a similar episode called The Islanders, in which the inhabitants of a remote island were brought to the UK, followed by a series of earth tremors which threatened the island. But they've got no resistance to the sort of 20th century way of life we have in the UK, no resistance to bugs and disease, and they are made ill by the food that we eat. And there was another episode called The Web of Fear, no relation to the Doctor Who serial from 1968, but about another mutated virus which was on the loose. By and large, certainly the first two series of Doomwatch were tough and gritty, and they dealt with things that people might not have been aware of, that they needed to be aware of. And I think it's fair to say that the show is responsible for the popularisation of the expression Doomwatch. It was a word that suddenly meant something, and it still resonates today. It's not associated with the series now, because obviously the series is 50-odd years old, but certainly the word Doomwatch is still rolled out as a Doomwatch scenario or a Doomwatch situation, and it all harkens back to this series with its explosive title sequence of the name Doomwatch looming up out of the screen and this striking theme music. The show drifted on into its third season, but before the third season it actually moved on to the big screen. And it's odd that the Doomwatch film, which came out in April 72, a few months before the third season debuted, this was produced by Tygon Films. And presumably, for international appeal reasons, the TV cast were sidelined and only appeared in a couple of scenes. So you had John Paul, we had Simon Oates, we had Jean Trend in her last appearance in a Doomwatch-related thing. But the film sidelined all the main cast and focused particularly on a never before or afterwards seen Doomwatch agent played by Ian Bannon, who travelled up to a remote Scottish island to investigate a strange new disease that seemed to be spreading across the population, which enraged them and sort of caused terrible physical deformities. An interesting film in itself, and it's more of a horror film than Doomwatch, which had been described at one point by Jerry Davies not as science fiction but science fact or sci-fact, because I think they were keen to make people realise it's speculative, but it's not science fiction, it's fiction with a scientific basis. Series 3 of Doomwatch came along, but things were not going well behind the scenes by now. Unfortunately, Kit Pedler and Jerry Davies had walked away from the series towards the end of season 2. They felt that Terence Dudley was taking it in a different direction, turning it into more of a thriller series, a slightly lurid thriller series, rather than a Doomwatch, this is what's happening out there, these are the things that can happen. And also Simon Oates was getting a bit restless as well. I think he wasn't entirely happy with the direction of the series, although he did agree to come back for a handful of episodes. But I think you can see from the very first episode of season 3 that the show was changing tack slightly, because in the first episode of that particular season, Ridge has a breakdown and steals vials of deadly bacteria, which could, and he threatens to, wipe out mankind. I mean, this is the stuff of James Bond films, Mission Impossible films, not a TV series that's, wagging a cautionary finger at scientific development. Ridge appeared later on in the series again. There was an episode that suggested that paint stored in his garage was responsible for his mental breakdown because it was poisoning him. But the series felt as if it was being a bit more sensationalist. There was an episode about students threatening to create an atomic device, the threat of London flooding due to variable weather conditions. And the series came to an end early on its 11th episode with an episode called Killer Dolphins, which probably says as much as I need to about the direction that the series was going in. There was a 12th episode called Sex and Violence. That's never been screened in the UK. I've seen it because the series came out on DVD many years ago. I think it was released by Simply Media. It's an interesting episode, but it was never shown because I think the BBC were a bit worried because the characters were felt to be based on the famous moral campaigners Lord Longford and Mary Whitehouse. And as I recall, there's even a character who's sort of based on Cliff Richard. And it's an odd episode because it is basically pure talk. Chris is called into a discussion about whether pornography is becoming too graphic and too rife and too readily available. It's basically people around a huge desk just discussing it with some clips illustrating what they're talking about. Not pornographic clips, but clips of violence. But the episode was never shown. In fact, the 13th episode was written but never produced. So the show limped off the air, not exactly a shadow of itself, but it had lost what had made it so unique and popular, particularly in its first series. However, season 3 wasn't to be quite the end of Doomwatch because Channel 5 bought the rights from the BBC, and in 1989 they released a feature-length film called Winter Angel, which starred Trevor Eve and with Philip Stone cast as an ageing Professor Quist. John Paul had unfortunately long since passed away. And this was quite an interesting film, which I haven't seen for years, but I remember watching it. Trevor Eve played Neil Tannehill, and the story was basically about a black hole that had been created in a laboratory facility somewhere in the UK, and Trevor Eve leading a group of investigators to establish how safe or dangerous this thing could possibly be. And I seem to recall it ended with Tannehill setting up Doomwatch again with the anticipation of a series to follow. Unfortunately, although the show did quite well in the ratings, it was very expensive to produce, and so Channel 5, not the most cash-rich channels at the best of times, opted not to proceed with the project, which is a shame. So Doomwatch is back on Talking Pictures. Unfortunately, it's not a complete run of episodes. There are 5 episodes missing from the first series. All of season 2 exists, and there are only 3 episodes still existing from season 3, including that unscreened episode Sex and Violence, which I understand is going to be screened by Talking Pictures TV. If you watch the show now, you will, of course, feel that it's creaky and old-fashioned and slow in some places. It is. It's very talky. There are lots of scenes of Chris and various characters arguing in offices and laboratories. It isn't a big spectacular show, and it does go out and about in episodes like The Invasion. It looks quite big and lavish, but it is of its time. There aren't much in the way of special effects. What special effects there are don't look very good to modern eyes because there's no CGI. There's none of that sort of stuff. The scenes on the plane in the first episode look very wonky, and I mentioned about the rat effects. So if you go into this wanting to watch something gritty and compelling and are not worried about wonky sets and so on and fluff lines, there's a lot of fluff lines for the actors because they just went in and did it. You know, that was the feeling at the time, that, you know, occasionally people fluffed the word, it didn't really matter. But I think it's the subject matter and the style of the show and what it was doing, the time it was doing it. Not every episode's a winner. There are some very dreary episodes. There's one about jet lag, I seem to recall. There's one about the effect of some sort of chromosome deficiency, which causes one particular character to moan that he's too tall. So, you know, they're not all great stories, but I think if you are a fan of classic old TV, you will get a lot out of Doomwatch. It's very entertaining, and I just think the most important thing about it is how ahead of its time it was and how I think it got people thinking about technology and pollution and the ecology. And even after the series had ended, I think that it had raised enough awareness that it kept the momentum going. So people have kept a watchful eye on these sorts of things. I suppose in some ways, Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror is the natural successor to Doomwatch in a different style. It's obviously an anthology show which takes certain scientific things that we're aware of today and postulates a future scenario where this could happen, that could happen, something apocalyptic could happen. So it's more of a cautionary series rather than Doomwatch, which was sort of keeping a watchful eye on what was going on. But could a series of Doomwatch work today? Could a show like this work today? When the original series came out on DVD a few years ago, I was lucky enough to have the chance to speak to Gene Trend, who played Faye Chantry in season 2, and she hadn't seen the episodes in years. And I remember asking her, do you think that a series like this could work today? I think she made a very valid point, that she didn't think it would. By the nature of television and the way TV is made today, it would probably be more sensationalist. It would probably be more science fiction than science fact. And science fact is what Kit Pedler and Jerry Davies were keen to deal with. But Doomwatch is an important TV series. It's an important piece of retro TV, and I would urge you, if you can, to set aside your thoughts about its production values and its slightly over-earnest acting occasionally. Focus on the stories, what it's saying and what it's doing, and how fascinating it is that back in the early 70s and late 60s, people were already thinking science needs to be reined in. Science needs to be controlled, because if it isn't, well, that's maybe the world we're living in today. Who knows? Doomwatch is on Friday nights on Talking Pictures. I would urge you to take a look at it if you're interested in classic vintage TV. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this rattle through Doomwatch. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you're going to watch Doomwatch. It's out there now for you to watch. If you prefer to watch it on DVD, you can still get hold of the box set. I think it's 25 odd quid on Amazon. But it's nice to see something like this being resurrected and screened on TV again. And I hope it finds a curious new audience. So yeah, like, subscribe, leave a comment. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.